Continuing on in this series of the I Am. And honestly, this is a series that I really like because we're going to get to see so many different characters come into play as we go throughout this series. So it was twofold. We used this series name as one way of showing that when you look at who God is, and somebody often will say in like the Bible, "Who are you, God?" He'll respond with, "I am." And so we use the title as I Am because of that, but then also because we're going to learn many different characters in this story, and they're going to introduce themselves to you. And so tonight, what we're going to see is that I am Abraham is who we're going to be talking through. And what I love about each one of these characters is that we're going to get to learn from them some key principles that they learned either in the right way or the hard way, through their lives and the situations that they faced. And so tonight, what I want to kind of do is I want to start off with telling you a little bit of a introduction to this by talking about legacy. So many of you know that I'm a Seahawks fan, and Russell Wilson was a Seahawks fan until this year, and then he went over to the Broncos. But I really loved one thing about him in particular. He would talk a lot about his faith. And that he, as an NFL player, was pretty vocal about, "I have a faith in God." And so I started to listen to some different podcasts that he was putting out. And through every one of his podcasts, he would bring on all of these key individuals in the country. Maybe they were these professional players. Maybe they were in the financial end of things. Maybe a high end in business. Whatever their role was. He always would ask them these different questions, but then he would talk about legacy. And he would say, "What would you say is your legacy?" If people were to define it for you. And then they would talk through that. But then he often would talk about, for him personally, his legacy was extremely important to him. That when he left, he didn't want people to just know that he was a football player and that he was a really good football player. But actually, he wanted a legacy that would be left behind, that would be where people would go, "You know what? He loved Jesus. He loved people. He cared for people. And he wanted Jesus' name to be known throughout the world." And so for him, that word legacy meant something extremely important to him. And I start that off tonight because honestly, here, what we're going to find tonight for Abraham is that his legacy was actually determined by his faith in the promises of God. And so that's why overarching all of his life is summed up in the word faith. And now I want to clarify this tonight because we're going to talk about faith a lot. What is faith? Do you have a definition of what faith would be? Because sometimes people will say, yeah, you have faith. Oftentimes you use it when you don't actually know the right answer to a question. "Oh, I have faith in that." But the reality is, here's the thing that I love about faith, is that faith isn't just this, "Well, if I don't have an answer, then I'll just say I have faith." And it's like this kind of wishy-washy term. But actually, faith is grounded in a lot of truth. That actually, when I say, "Hey, I have faith in God," I'm looking at it and saying, why do I have faith? Because I can look at the character of God and the ways that he showed up in so many different people's lives, and I've seen how he's come through time after time after time, that I say I have faith because I also know that there is power behind the truth of what God is and who his character is. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, is what Abraham's faith. Yet in order for us to understand it, I need you guys to understand this. We talked for the first week about creation, right? For the I Am series. And then the next week, Ryan came up and he taught about sin entering into the world. And when sin entered the world, ultimately, God, at the beginning of Genesis, is dealing a lot with sin on a major scale. And he's bringing about Adam and Eve being sent out of the garden. He then goes in and we have Noah in the flood, where the entire population on earth was wiped out other than Noah and his family. And then we move on into Genesis, and it talks about the Tower of Babel, where they said, we don't need God. We're going to build our own empire. And so God, as they were building this massive tower, confused all of their languages, and so they couldn't all speak, and so they dispersed from there. And so all of these different events are where God is honestly dealing with sin in a major way. But then what I love about Genesis chapter 12 is that it starts to switch. This is the I am persons that we're going to meet. This is where God is starting to deal with sin and to rescue his people through specific individuals. And so Abraham enters the scene in Genesis chapter 12. And so what I want us to first look at is that Abraham, here at the beginning of Genesis 12, and we're going to be going from Genesis 12 all the way through Genesis chapter 25. I'm not going to read through all of that. So I'm going to give you like flyover versions of his entire life, okay? But in Genesis chapter 12, at the very beginning, Abraham was given a simple calling by God, and ultimately he began his faith journey. So let me go ahead and I'm going to read with you from chapter 12, verse 1, and it says this: "The Lord had said to Abram, 'Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you.'" So here, right off the bat, we don't have a lot of understanding of who Abraham is prior to this moment, but we know that Abram right here is being called to go. It was a clear call by God, yet at the same time, when you read that specifically, we don't really know everything that's about to happen. Like, can you imagine Abram standing there in this moment, God speaking to him and saying, "Hey, go leave everything"? My first questions that would start to pop into my mind as soon as God would say that is probably, what land is he sending me to? Because, like, think about in today's culture, if I was to all of a sudden be sent to Iran, that's very different than if I was being sent to the Bahamas, right? Like, I would probably be a little bit more okay with being sent to the Bahamas than I would be to Iran. And in the same way, for Abram in this moment, he is being called to a place, but he has no clue where he's going. And then a second thing that I think would run into my mind is that I would say, okay, why do I have to leave everything behind? Like, why does all of my family have to stay back? Why do I have to leave this specific country? Why, God? Why? And yet, in this moment, where I'm sure Abram is having things running through his mind, God offers him hope. Because he continues and he says, and this is God speaking, "I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous. And you will be a blessing to others, and I will bless those who bless you. And, get this, I will curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you." Now, doesn't that take a different approach all of a sudden when God says all of those promises? All of a sudden now, here, Abram hears God make these powerful statements. "I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to make you famous. I'm going to use you to bless other people. I'm going to protect you from those that want to harm you." All of those things, I think we would think in our own minds and say, you know what? That doesn't sound too bad, God. And so Abram responds. So it says, "So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him," which was his nephew. "And Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran," this location that he was living in. And so even though Abram didn't fully understand the context of where he was going to, he had a confidence, he had faith in his God that he would provide for him. So tonight, what I want you guys to think about, if we take what Abram learned in this very first part and we bring it to today, what might God be calling you to, even though you may not exactly know what he's calling you to? Because here's the reality. God is preparing you, all of you, to bless others. And ultimately, God is intending the best for your life. We see this constantly throughout Abram's storyline, and you're going to see more of this play out as we go forward. And so, how is God preparing you to bless others? How is God intending the best for your life? And how can you place your faith in God, trust in him going forward? See, picking back up in the story for Abram, what happened after he left this unknown land that he's heading off into? Well, we're going to pick up now, skipping forward 3 chapters. We're going to jump into chapter 15. And what we start to see is that God actually reveals his incredible covenant with Abram. See, it says at the very first verse of chapter 15, sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." See, I want you to focus in. The very first part of that, what does it say? Sometime later. How much time actually passed between chapter 12 and chapter 15? It's not exactly clear. But I will tell you there's a lot that's happened in that amount of time. Here, let me give you a little experience of what Abram's already gone through. So they end up in Egypt, and the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, actually starts flirting with Abram's wife and brings her into his family. Weird, creepy a little bit. Abram does nothing about it. And all of a sudden, there's a whole bunch of plagues that start taking place in Egypt. And the Pharaoh's going, "What is happening to all of us?" And then Abram goes, "Oh yeah, so kind of, just so you know, so she's my wife, and you have her in your family," and took her as your wife. Yeah. So that happened. And then also, there were a moment where Abram was actually called, and he went and killed entire tribes. These dudes were beasts. They went and wiped out nations. And then, on top of that, in that 3-chapter thing, there was also a rescue of Lot against 9 different kings. And that they went into the middle of a war and pulled Lot out of it. And then, on top of that, there was a blessing, a special blessing that was given to Abram by a man named Melchizedek, which we're going to talk about him later in the year. And so all of these different things took place in those 3 chapters, sometime later. And so what I'm trying to show you is that a lot has happened for Abram since the moment that God first gave this promise. And so God is circling back in this moment, reminding Abram once again of the promises all those years ago that he made to Abram. And so Abram is confused, though. Why? Well, because in verse 2 it says, "But Abram replied, 'O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all of my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, and so one of my servants will be an heir.'" See, in this moment, Abram has a pretty valid assessment of his situation. In this culture, and still today, what happens if you don't have a son? What happens to your family line? It ends, right? The name doesn't carry on for the family. So in the same way, and even to a greater extent at this time period, if you don't have a son, your family line ends. And yet God's promise was that he was going to have generations to come that would follow after him. So how would this be possible, God, if I don't have a son? Valid assessment, right? I mean, that's pretty logical to ask God what's going on. But then in verse 4, the Lord responds and says to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." And then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That is how many descendants you will have." And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted it as righteous because of his what? Faith. See, God's promises to Abram wasn't going to be half-baked. Have you guys ever had a half-baked thing? Sometimes it's gross, unless it's a cookie. But in most situations, a half-baked thing, if you have a steak come out and it's still cold on the inside, that's not a good situation, okay? But here's the reality. for God, in this same way here in this moment, he's saying, my promises are not going to be half-baked. They're not going to be half-cooked. Abram wasn't going to have his promises kept through this slave. Rather, it was going to be through a blood child of his own. And the statement from the Lord was enough in that moment for Abram to believe what God said. So what I want you guys to understand from Abram tonight in this moment is that God doesn't offer you promises that he will only put minimal effort into. Rather, God offers promises that bring out the best outcome for your life. Doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be easy, but it means that it's going to be ultimately the best for you in the end. And so what I want us to do is, even in Abram's large acts of faith, in the moment of him walking out into a distant land that he didn't know where he was going, and in this moment where God is setting out these promises once again, and he's having to all of a sudden have this faith in God, did he remain actually faithful to God? Because it's one thing to say something, but did he actually follow through on what he said? Well, that's where we pick up in chapter 16. See, in chapter 16, even Abram was imperfect. And in that moment in chapter 16, as we're about to read, he actually lost faith in God's promise. Why? Because here, when we enter into chapter 16, we're seeing Sarai, his wife, and she's having an issue going on that was putting a strain on Abram's faith in the promises of God. Because see, here it says in verse 1, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him. Problem, right? When God all of a sudden is saying, hey, you're going to have a child that will carry on your family line, and now they can't have children, Abram's starting to get a little nervous here. So they concocted this idea, and they started to think about it a little bit and going, well, you know, God said that ultimately you're going to have a bloodline through you, a child that's going to be born of you. And so they believed they could actually resolve or fulfill God's promises in their own way. So the second part of verse 1 says this, but she, Sarai, his wife, had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. And so Sarai said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children. So go sleep with my servant, because I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. And so Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar and the Egyptian servant and gave her to Abram as a wife. And this happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. So understand this. One, first, this practice of like giving a slave to a husband if like his wife can't have children, this was actually a pretty normal occurrence in that time period. Like for us, that seems weird, but like in that culture, again, like I said, carrying on your family line was that important. And so if your current wife couldn't have a child, then they could bring another like woman in, one of your slaves, and you could have a child through them, and the family line would continue. Okay? So Abram and Sarai in this moment are trying to fulfill God's promises still in their own strength and on their own. They've forgotten God in the whole equation. And so now they're sidestepping, they're shortcutting God in hopes of fulfilling his very promises. Do you see the irony in that? The fact that they are forgetting God, who they're trying to get God's promises. I mean, I literally don't know anything else to say other than that, because reading this, honestly, to us as readers, we get to see the whole picture, and so it's shocking to us. Because we're thinking, what are you doing in this moment? However, the reality is oftentimes we can do the same thing in our own lives. We can start short-circuiting God in hopes of having promises fulfilled in our life that God has already promised to us. That actually in our own lives, we can start to say, you know, God wants the best for me, and so I know what the best is supposed to be for my life, and we go off in a different direction than what God's calling us to. It's really easy to do. Maybe not the same circumstances here, but it's easy to do that kind of thing in our own lives. But do you know what? It continues in verses 4 through 6 like this. The whole situation heads in the wrong direction. Because verse 4 picks up and said, so Abram had, sexual relations with Hagar, and guess what? She became pregnant. No, go figure. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress, Sarai, with contempt. Then Sarai, get this gets all messy, okay? Then Sarai said to Abram, so his wife, this is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. And the Lord will show me or show us who's wrong, you or me. Do you get this? There's a whole lot going on in this situation. See, and then it gets better. It gets better because it says Abram replied, look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit. And then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. Do you get this whole situation? Do you see what happened here when they didn't follow the promises that God had intended for their life and they short-circuited God? They thought that they were doing the right thing. They hoped they were doing the right thing. And yet, in this moment, they've made a major problem out of the situation. And I'll say this. Ishmael, who Hagar's son is when he's born after this situation, we still have his generation here today. And it is the largest contention between Israel and them. Those two families have been still battling it out in today's culture. And we see the wars taking place in the Middle East against these two family lines. So do you see why this was such a big deal in this moment? Little did they know what was going to be happening even 2,000 years later, today. And so I'm going to kind of pause for a second because here's what I want to show you. For me, I look at the situation, I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that this ever happened. And yet, in my own life, I've seen this happen. Not to the extent of what's going on right here, okay? But like for me, and it's really funny because some of you know that I actually went up to a state cross-country meet over the weekend. I was on that course, and it brings back a lot of memories because it's the same course I ran on. And in my junior year, I've explained a little bit of this in my own testimony, that during that year, I had originally started my cross-country season really saying, I want to live for God in my running abilities. I knew that I was probably going to do pretty decent because my family was good at running. But then I got better and better throughout the season to the point where I was at the state level doing quite well. And things shifted from the beginning of the season of me wanting to live for God to all of a sudden at the end of the season, I started living for myself. And that I wanted people to know who I was, how good I was. And it shifted in my mind of who was supposed to be the most important, God or me. And in that moment, it was me. And you know what? In that moment, too, what was going on in the background was that Bree and I were actually really good friends, and she knew my desire for the season. So she came out, flew all the way from Washington State, and went to my state meet. And so she drives up, and like I'm embarrassed about talking about it now because in that situation it just felt so messy. But I had started to grow to like a different girl on the team. You can kind of see the problem that started happening because here I am, I'm starting to like this other girl, and Bree is showing up from Washington to come watch me race. Well, naturally, I felt pretty guilty about the whole situation. And in that moment, I was panicking a lot because I felt really bad that I started to like this other girl. And so, and we hadn't defined the relationship at that moment yet, but still, I felt like, man, like I shouldn't be liking this other girl, and then Bree's coming out, and maybe I like her, like I don't know what's going on. And so in that moment, a lot of mess was starting to happen, okay? I'm going to pause that story. So, we're picking back up in Genesis chapter 17. Don't worry, the story's not done. But In Genesis chapter 17, this is a powerful, powerful moment in Abram's life. Because what we start to see is that God sees Abram's lack of faith, and yet he still remains faithful to his covenant with Abram. He still remains faithful to the promises that he said long ago. See, the beauty of Abram's story is that he made a mistake in this moment, a big mistake. And God still remained faithful to him, even through it. And this is what I want you guys to understand too as we go throughout these next weeks. The beauty of the Bible is that it's a whole bunch of broken people still being used by God on his rescue mission for us. That's what I love about the Bible. And so, what I want us to do is I want us to read chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. And it says this: when Abram was 99 years old, okay, get this, he's old. And then the Lord appeared to him and said, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you, by which I will guarantee to you countless descendants. Again, reminding him of that promise. And it says, at this, Abram fell face down on the ground. And then God said to him, this is my covenant with you. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. And what's more, I am changing your name. Okay? It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abraham. For you will be the father of many nations. And I will make you extremely fruitful. And your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among you. I will confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you from generation to generation. And this is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God, and the God of your descendants after you. And I will give you the entire land of Canaan, where you will live as a foreigner, to you and your descendants. And it will be their possession forever. And I will be their God. Guys, this moment here reveals that God is not done with Abraham. But by changing his name from Abram to Abraham, he's revealing that his amazing promises in this moment will continue to be fulfilled generation to generation to generation. You know, the reality is there's times in different families dynamics where there have been like abuse or those kind of things. And you know what you start to see a lot of times is when abuse happens, it goes generation to generation. It gets passed down. In the same way, in this moment, in a good way, God will be with each one of these generations, guiding them, helping them, bringing them back, rescuing them once again. And here, in this moment, God is making that promise to Abram. If I heard God say that to me, that my generations forward, for hundreds of years, that God was going to be close to them, walking with them, I'm telling you, that would be a powerful moment for me, just like it was for Abraham in this moment. And so what I want to do is actually skip forward. Chapter 21. Again, more time has passed. And here's the moment where God is fulfilling that promise. Because in verse 1 it says, then the Lord kept his word, and he did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. And this happened at just the time God had said it would. Again, did you get that? Just the time God said that it would happen. This happened, and Abraham named their son Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded, and Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. For me, again, they lived longer than we did, but in this world, I was just like, as your son is there. And then Sarah declared, God has brought me laughter. All who hear about this will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby, and yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age? And so in this moment, we see God starting to fulfill those promises through Isaac. So if we now fly forward over 2,000 years ago, to now, this is the moment where we pick up on my story, okay? So in this moment, Bree is flown out to this state meet, and I feel really embarrassed about the whole situation. And in that moment, that weekend, I didn't treat Bree the best way. Because honestly, I panicked so much that I just really didn't talk to her much. Not the best situation when she's like coming over to your house and you're just kind of like, she's asking you questions and you're not saying much. Not a good thing, right, girls? Like if you were going to meet a guy and he like didn't even talk to you, yeah, again, it would not be good. So that was me. Again, I messed up. But here's the really cool thing about it, full circle for me. God did a huge working in my life. And honestly, when I tell my own faith story now, this is part of it because it was so impactful in my life. Because for me, I learned a huge lesson of humility because of all of that. Because in that moment, after that weekend, Bree called me back and said, you know what? I watched you this weekend, and you said that you wanted to live for God, but you're not right now. And you know what? That woke me up. In that moment in my life, I looked at it and I said, you know what? That's right. I am prideful right now. I want people to see me. And so in that moment, I had to humble myself and say, God, I'm wrong right now. And I need you to bring me back to yourself. And you know what? One, it fixed the relationship with Bree. I hope you figured that out. But at the same time, it fixed my relationship with God in a big way. And so in the same way for Abraham, he came to a moment where he was like, you know what? I've messed up. And God still brought him back, provided him Isaac. And we've seen generations to come. And we are going to actually see many of Isaac's children. We're going to talk about Isaac. We're going to talk about some of his descendants in the rest of the I Am series and the ways that God is continuing these promises. And yet, finally, we're going to close with this, is that Abraham was faced with a life-altering test of faith, and he responded once again. And how did he respond? Because here in chapter 22, we jump into the next one. We conclude with Abraham's ultimate story of faith being tested. And it says, once again, God's giving Abraham here in this moment another opportunity to put his faith to the test in verse 9. So here, Abraham's been called by God to go up into the wilderness and to give a sacrifice to God. And he also called for Isaac, his son, to go with him. And so they pack everything up, okay? And then in verse 9 it says, when they arrived at the place where God had told him to go, Abraham built an altar, and he arranged the wood on top of it. And then, get this, he tied his son, Isaac, and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice, because that's what God had called him to do. Now, if you just read that, it's like pretty disturbing. But if you also understand the story of Abram and Abraham, once he became Abraham, you understand that this is a huge deal. God's calling him to kill his son that would carry on his family line, that would destroy the promises that God had given him. And yet, the power of verse 10, where Abraham actually picks the knife up and is committed to do it to God. And he doesn't know the situation of why God's calling it to him, but he had faith that God would still keep his promise somehow, some way. And so Abraham showed his faith by trusting God even when he didn't fully understand the context. He didn't short-circuit God this time. He didn't sidestep God's promises. He followed what God was calling him to. And yet God spared Isaac from his death. Because in verse 11 it says, at that moment, right as soon as he's about to plunge the knife down into Isaac, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. Yes, Abraham replied. Here I am. Did you get that? Take away the here. I am. God is responding with his name to Abraham. I am. Don't lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. And so in this moment, this faith is what's talked about for generations to come. And I'm excited about talking about this because we're going to go through Hebrews in the New Testament later this year. And what you're going to see is in chapter 11, I believe, 11 or 12, 11. And it's the Hall of Faith is basically what they call it. And Abraham is talked about here because of this faith that he had in this moment. Abraham was placed with another test of his faith, and yet he responded trusting God. He was willing to risk it all for his faith in God. See, the reality is here in the now what's, honestly, Abraham, his legacy was determined by his faith in the promises of God. You see that clearly from chapters 12 all the way through chapter 25. And yet, I was thinking about it this way, for us, your legacy, the way that you walk out of this life, and when people look back at your life 50 years down the road, 100 years down the road, your legacy is determined by your faith in the promises of God. Because I'll tell you this, people won't remember if you were good in sports like I did. People don't remember that for long. You're not going to be remembered because you had a whole bunch of money. You're not going to be remembered because you had a whole bunch of friends. You're not going to be remembered because you had some kind of job. But I will tell you what makes a huge difference in people's lives is your faith in God. When they see that you can go through any situation in life, the good and the bad, and that you remain faithful to God in all of them, and know that he ultimately has the best for your life. So your legacy is determined by your faith in the promises of God. So the question is tonight, and the way that I want to end it, is how will you respond? How are you going to respond to that? Abraham was put to tests. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he failed. And yet, his legacy still continues on, and we're reading it today. What is your legacy? Let's pray. God, I thank you so much for tonight, this opportunity for us to come and look at Abraham's life and to see the ways in which you worked in his life powerfully. I thank you for his faith, but ultimately, God, we know that you gave him that faith. And so, God, I ask that for each one of these students, as they walk through this week, as they walk through this month, as they walk through the next year, as they walk through the rest of their life, that no matter what situation they come through, that they would look back at this story, see the ways that you've powerfully answered and fulfilled your promises to Abraham, that actually carries on to them as well, and that you have the best intended for their lives, and that they can walk in faith and in trust after you. And I pray this in your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen.